In his final years, Joel Goldsmith delivered a warning so urgent that many who heard it felt their entire spiritual foundation shake. This wasn't about theology or religious debate. This was about survival of consciousness itself. What he revealed challenges everything you've been taught about protection, safety, and spiritual power in these accelerating times. Most people are walking through life completely unaware of the invisible forces shaping their reality. They pray for protection while remaining spiritually defenseless. They seek safety in rituals while ignoring the one truth that actually shields consciousness. Joel's final warning wasn't given to frighten you, but to awaken you to your true nature before circumstances force that awakening. The warning Joel left wasn't pessimistic. It was brutally honest about what happens when humanity forgets its divine identity. He saw patterns emerging, collective consciousness shifts that would either elevate or devastate depending on one simple factor: whether you remember who you really are. This remembering isn't philosophical. It's the difference between being tossed by every storm or standing unmoved in your true spiritual ground. Joel observed something troubling in his final teachings. Spiritual students were becoming more dependent on external practices rather than internal realization. They collected techniques like armor, not understanding that true protection comes from a completely different source. He watched as fear-based spirituality grew stronger, while consciousness-based truth grew dimmer in human awareness. His warning was specific. A time is coming, perhaps already here, when external circumstances will test every soul's foundation. Those standing on religious beliefs will find those beliefs insufficient. Those relying on positive thinking will discover thoughts alone cannot sustain them. Only those who've realized their identity as consciousness itself will have the stability to navigate what's emerging in our world. This wasn't about predicting catastrophe. Joel simply recognized that humanity faces a choice point. Either we awaken to our divine nature now, through deliberate spiritual practice, or life circumstances will force that awakening through crisis. He preferred students choose the gentler path of conscious realization rather than wait for forced awakening through difficulty and suffering. The core of Joel's final warning centers on one overlooked truth. You are not a person having spiritual experiences. You are spiritual consciousness appearing as a person. This isn't wordplay or philosophy. This is the fundamental recognition that changes everything about how you move through life, especially as external conditions become more chaotic and unpredictable. When you forget your true identity as consciousness, you become vulnerable to every suggestion, every fear, every collective panic that sweeps through humanity. You react to conditions as if they have power over you. You defend a false sense of self that was never real to begin with. Joel saw millions of people investing their entire spiritual practice in protecting something that doesn't actually exist. His warning was clear. The time for playing with spiritual concepts has passed. Now is the moment for genuine realization. Not understanding about consciousness, but living as consciousness. Not thinking divine thoughts, but recognizing yourself as divine awareness itself. This shift from intellectual knowledge to living realization is what Joel called the most urgent work of our time, and perhaps all time. Joel's final teaching pointed to a specific practice he considered essential for these times. He called it conscious awareness of presence, not God as separate from you, protecting you from outside threats, but God as your very consciousness, the awareness reading these words right now. This presence isn't something you acquire. It's what you are when all false identity falls away completely. Most spiritual practice tries to get something, become something, or protect something. Joel's final warning dismantles this entire approach. There's nothing to get because you already are what you seek. There's nothing to become because consciousness never changes. There's nothing to protect because your true self cannot be threatened by any condition or circumstance in the material world. The practice is deceptively simple but profound in its effects. Throughout your day, pause and recognize the awareness that's present. Not your thoughts about awareness, not feelings of peace or connection. The simple fact of consciousness itself, unchanging and eternal, completely untouched by whatever appears in your experience right now. This recognition, repeated until it becomes your natural state, is Joel's final gift to a world desperately needing spiritual stability. Margaret discovered Joel's final warning during the darkest period of her life. Her business had collapsed, her health was failing, and every spiritual practice she'd learned over 20 years suddenly felt empty and powerless. She attended one of Joel's final recorded talks, not expecting anything but desperate for any thread of hope to grasp in her deteriorating circumstances. When Joel spoke about consciousness being your true identity, something shifted inside her. Not a feeling or emotion, but a quiet recognition that she'd been defending and protecting a false self her entire life. All her prayers had been attempts to fix a person who didn't actually exist, except as a collection of thoughts and beliefs she'd mistakenly identified as herself. For 3 weeks, Margaret practiced what Joel taught. Every morning, before the day's problems could capture her attention, she sat and recognized the simple fact of awareness, not trying to feel peaceful or spiritual, just noticing consciousness itself, the unchanging presence that observed all her difficulties without being touched by them. Something fundamental began shifting in her experience, though her external circumstances hadn't yet changed. By the 6th week, Margaret noticed something remarkable. The same business problems that had paralyzed her with fear now seemed less solid, less threatening. Not because they'd disappeared, but because she'd stopped experiencing them from the position of a frightened person. She was watching from consciousness itself, and from that perspective, no material condition held power over her. David's story reveals the depth of Joel's warning. As a physician, David had spent 30 years healing bodies while his own consciousness remained unhealed. He practiced meditation, attended spiritual retreats, studied every tradition, yet felt increasingly fragmented and unstable as world conditions grew more chaotic, and medical practice became more demanding and less fulfilling. Joel's final warning hit David like lightning. He realized his entire spiritual practice had been another form of medical treatment, trying to fix a person rather than recognizing the consciousness that needed no fixing. Every technique he'd learned was designed to improve David the person. None addressed the fundamental misidentification that created all his suffering in the first place. The shift took months, not days. David would catch himself slipping back into person consciousness, trying to manage and control his experience. Then he'd remember, I am not this collection of thoughts and feelings. I am the awareness in which all experience appears. Gradually, over repeated recognition, his center of gravity shifted from personal identity to consciousness itself. What emerged surprised David completely. His medical practice didn't collapse, it transformed. He found himself treating patients from presence rather than from medical knowledge alone. His diagnostic accuracy improved. His stress levels dropped. Most remarkably, patients began reporting healings that exceeded purely physical treatment. Something in his consciousness was affecting their consciousness, demonstrating exactly what Joel had taught about spiritual identity having practical effects. Sarah's transformation through Joel's final teaching reveals its power in family dynamics. For 15 years, she'd struggled with her teenage daughter's rebellion and anger. Every parenting technique failed. Every prayer seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. The relationship deteriorated until they barely spoke, living as strangers under the same roof despite Sarah's desperate attempts at connection. When Sarah encountered Joel's warning about false identity, she initially dismissed it as too abstract for her practical problems. She needed parenting solutions, not mystical philosophy. But something nagged at her conscience. What if her entire approach had been defending Sarah the mother rather than living as consciousness itself? What if her daughter was reacting to false identity rather than true presence? The practice felt awkward at first. Instead of trying to fix their relationship, Sarah began recognizing consciousness during their interactions, not thinking about it or visualizing it, simply noticing the awareness present in the room, the consciousness that was both her and her daughter's true identity beneath their conflicting personalities and histories. Within 2 months, without any direct conversation about their issues, something shifted between them. Her daughter began initiating conversations. The anger softened. Sarah realized she'd been trying to control outcomes from person consciousness when she should have been present as consciousness itself. Joel's final warning had transformed not just her spiritual practice, but her most important human relationship through simple recognition of true identity. These transformation stories point to Joel's central warning. We're running out of time for intellectual spirituality. The conditions emerging in our world will require lived realization, not collected concepts. Those who've made the shift from person consciousness to consciousness itself will navigate coming changes from an entirely different foundation than those still identified with personal self and material conditions. Joel never specified exactly what conditions he foresaw. That wasn't the point. His warning addressed something deeper. Your spiritual foundation either rests on eternal consciousness or on shifting sand of personal identity and material circumstances. When pressure increases, and it will, your foundation determines whether you stand firm or collapse under the weight of collective fear. If these transformation stories inspire you to explore Joel Goldsmith's profound teachings, like this video to help others discover these crucial truths, subscribe for more life-changing spiritual wisdom and comment below. Which story resonated most deeply with your own spiritual journey right now? Beyond the basic practice of recognizing consciousness, Joel offered complementary techniques that deepen your stability and true identity. The first he called the practice of non-reaction. When circumstances trigger emotional response, pause before reacting. In that pause, recognize consciousness itself, the awareness untouched by whatever triggered you. This simple pause interrupts identification with person consciousness. Most spiritual seeking tries to change or improve conditions. Joel's complementary practice does something radically different. It recognizes that consciousness doesn't need conditions to change. Your true self remains complete, whether circumstances are pleasant or difficult. This recognition doesn't make you passive. It makes you responsive from wisdom rather than reactive from fear and personal identification. The second technique Joel emphasized was what he called treatment through recognition. Instead of praying for things to change, recognize the truth of consciousness in any situation, not affirming or declaring or visualizing, simply recognizing what's already true beneath appearances. Consciousness is present, complete, and untouched by material conditions. This practice works with health, relationships, finances, or any area where you're tempted to see problem and solution. Joel taught that problems exist only in person consciousness. In consciousness itself, there's only presence. Your work isn't to fix appearances, but to recognize truth. This recognition naturally adjusts what appears, though not always in ways your personal mind expects. Joel's third complementary technique addresses desire and attachment, which he saw as major obstacles to living as consciousness. The practice: observe your desires without judging them or trying to fulfill them immediately. Notice the wanting without being consumed by it. This observation creates space between consciousness and desire, revealing they're not the same thing at all. When you're identified with person consciousness, every desire feels urgent and defining. I want becomes I am. Your entire sense of self gets wrapped up in getting what you want and avoiding what you don't want. Joel recognized this as the source of most human suffering and spiritual instability in difficult times. The practice isn't about suppressing desire or pretending you don't want things. It's about recognizing consciousness itself, which has no desires because it's already complete. From that recognition, desires still appear, but they don't control you. You can pursue goals without being destroyed if they don't manifest. You can work toward outcomes without losing yourself when circumstances shift unexpectedly. Over weeks and months of this practice, something fundamental shifts. You discover you're far less vulnerable to disappointment and far more stable when life doesn't match your preferences. This isn't resignation or defeat. It's freedom. Joel saw this freedom as essential preparation for times when external conditions become increasingly unpredictable and beyond personal control. The fourth technique Joel offered relates to other people and collective consciousness. He taught what he called impersonal love, not the emotional attachment we usually call love, but recognition of consciousness as the true identity of everyone you encounter. This recognition dissolves the barriers that create conflict and separation between people. When you see others as separate persons, you judge them, fear them, or try to control them. Person consciousness creates endless conflict because every person consciousness defends itself against other person consciousnesses. Joel saw this dynamic accelerating in collective human experience, creating the very conditions he warned would test everyone's spiritual foundation. The practice transforms relationships from the inside out. When you encounter someone, even someone threatening or disagreeable, pause and recognize consciousness as their true identity, not as a mental exercise but as genuine recognition. This doesn't mean you trust dangerous people or accept harmful behavior. It means you stop reacting to personalities and start responding from consciousness itself. This practice builds a different kind of stability. You become less reactive to collective fear and panic because you're not identified with the collective person consciousness that generates those reactions. You can observe world events without being swept into mass hysteria. Joel considered this impersonal love essential for maintaining spiritual equilibrium when collective consciousness becomes increasingly unstable and reactive. Joel's fifth complementary technique addresses thought itself. He taught what he called the witness practice. Observe your thoughts without believing them or arguing with them. Just watch thoughts arise and dissolve like clouds passing through the sky of consciousness. This watching reveals that you're not your thoughts. You're the awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear continuously. Most spiritual practice tries to control or improve thinking. Joel's approach transcends that entire struggle. When you recognize yourself as consciousness, thoughts lose their power to define you or control your experience. You can have fearful thoughts without being afraid. You can have angry thoughts without being angry. The thoughts become weather patterns in consciousness rather than truth about reality. This practice takes consistent effort over weeks and months. Your habit of identifying with thoughts is deeply ingrained. But gradually, with repeated witness practice, you discover a stability that doesn't depend on having the right thoughts or maintaining positive thinking. You're stable because you're grounded in consciousness itself, which remains unchanged regardless of which thoughts happen to appear right now. Joel saw this witness practice as critical preparation for times of collective mental turbulence. When fear-based thinking dominates collective consciousness, you need the ability to observe without being consumed. This isn't denial or spiritual bypassing. It's the practical skill of remaining centered in consciousness when the mental atmosphere becomes toxic and threatening to personal stability. Now we must address the challenges Joel knew students would face. The first and most common: nothing seems to happen when you practice consciousness recognition. You sit, you notice awareness, and your life continues exactly as before. This seeming lack of results causes most people to abandon the practice and return to techniques that promise faster, more dramatic changes. Joel anticipated this obstacle completely. The practice of recognizing consciousness doesn't produce dramatic experiences because consciousness is already what you are. You're not acquiring something new. You're recognizing what's always been true. The shift is subtle, often invisible at first, like turning a massive ship. The direction changes long before you see different scenery approaching. Most spiritual seekers are addicted to experience and phenomena. They want visions, feelings, energy sensations, something to prove their practice is working. Joel's final warning challenges this entire orientation. The most profound transformation often feels like nothing at all. It's the quiet recognition that gradually becomes your default state. So subtle you might not notice until you look back and realize you're responding to life completely differently now. The solution to this challenge isn't to try harder or add more techniques. It's to trust the process even when nothing seems to be happening. Continue recognizing consciousness multiple times daily. Let weeks pass without demanding results. Joel promised that recognition of truth always bears fruit, though not always in the timeline or form your personal mind expects or demands. The second major challenge: old patterns return with a vengeance after you've tasted consciousness. You have a breakthrough experience where person consciousness dissolves and true identity becomes clear. Then, days or weeks later, you're completely re-identified with personal self, caught in the same fears and reactions you thought you'd transcended forever. Joel called this the rhythm of realization. Consciousness recognition deepens through cycles of clarity and obscuration, not through linear progress. When old patterns return, it doesn't mean you failed or lost what you gained. It means you're in the natural rhythm of awakening, moving between person consciousness and consciousness itself until the latter becomes increasingly stable. The challenge is not taking these returns to old patterns as evidence that nothing real happened. Many students quit here, concluding the whole approach doesn't work because they're still having personal reactions after moments of genuine recognition. Joel taught that these cycles are part of the process, not evidence of its failure. Each return to consciousness awareness, even after falling back into person consciousness, deepens the groove. What helps most during these cycles is self-compassion without self-indulgence. When you catch yourself re-identified with person consciousness, simply recognize consciousness again without judgment or disappointment. The practice isn't about achieving permanent transcendence of personality. It's about returning to consciousness awareness more quickly each time you notice you've drifted into person identification and reactive patterns. The third challenge Joel addressed: spiritual isolation when you're practicing consciousness recognition while everyone around you remains identified with person consciousness. Your relationships feel strained, conversations feel shallow. You seem to be operating from a completely different paradigm than the people you love, work with, and encounter daily. This challenge is particularly acute because consciousness practice often removes you from the collective agreements that most human relating depends on. When others are anxious about circumstances, your lack of reactivity might seem like indifference. When others want to process emotions extensively, your grounding in consciousness might appear cold. Misunderstanding is common during this transition phase. Joel's guidance here was nuanced. Don't use consciousness as escape from human connection. Don't use spiritual realization as excuse for emotional unavailability. Consciousness includes the human experience. It doesn't exclude it. You can be grounded in awareness while still showing up fully in relationships, expressing emotion, and engaging with practical life circumstances. The balance takes time to develop. Initially, you might swing between extremes, either getting pulled back into reactive person consciousness to maintain relationships, or detaching into spiritual isolation that damages connections. Gradually, you learn to stay rooted in consciousness while simultaneously being present in human experience. This integration is the mature expression of Joel's teachings in practical daily life. The fourth challenge connects directly to Joel's final warning: external circumstances that genuinely threaten your well-being or the well-being of those you love. It's one thing to recognize consciousness when life is relatively stable. It's another entirely when facing serious health crisis, financial catastrophe, or real danger. This is precisely the test Joel warned was coming for all spiritual students. The challenge isn't philosophical here. When your child is sick or your home is at risk, consciousness recognition can feel irrelevant or even cruel. Person consciousness screams for action, for fixing, for controlling outcomes. Every instinct pulls you into reactive fear. This is where Joel's final warning becomes intensely practical. Only genuine realization sustains you here, not concepts about consciousness. Joel never promised that recognizing consciousness removes all difficulty from life. He promised something different. Consciousness itself remains undisturbed regardless of what circumstances appear. Your work during crisis isn't to make everything okay for the person. It's to remain grounded in consciousness itself while taking whatever practical actions wisdom indicates in the situation. If these challenge-breaking insights resonate with your spiritual journey, like this video to support others finding Joel Goldsmith's profound wisdom. Subscribe for advanced consciousness practices that transform real-life difficulties. And comment, which challenge are you actively working through right now? Advanced integration of Joel's final warning requires understanding consciousness in action, not just in meditation. Robert's experience illustrates this perfectly. As a corporate executive, he faced constant pressure, difficult decisions affecting hundreds of employees, and responsibility that kept him awake nights worrying about outcomes and consequences beyond his control. After working with consciousness recognition for 8 months, Robert faced his most difficult decision yet: closing a division that would eliminate 40 jobs while potentially saving the entire company. Person consciousness offered only 2 options: paralyzing guilt or ruthless detachment. Neither felt like truth. Neither honored the complexity of his responsibility and the humanity involved. Robert practiced consciousness recognition throughout the decision-making process, not to escape the difficulty, but to make the decision from awareness rather than from fear or ego protection. He consulted experts, ran analyses, explored alternatives, all while remaining grounded in consciousness itself. The decision didn't become easier, but it became clearer. What emerged surprised him. From consciousness, he could hold both the necessity of the decision and compassion for those affected. He could take difficult action without becoming hardened or defensive. He could feel appropriate sadness without being destroyed by guilt. Joel's teaching had given him access to a completely different way of moving through impossible situations without losing his humanity or stability. Jennifer's advanced application of Joel's warning appeared in her healing practice. As an energy worker, she'd always approached clients as separate people needing her help to fix their problems. This orientation exhausted her and limited what was possible in sessions, because everything depended on her personal effort and technique to make healing happen. After studying Joel's final teachings for a year, Jennifer began experimenting with consciousness-based practice. Instead of trying to heal people, she recognized consciousness as the truth of both herself and her clients. She didn't work on them from outside. She recognized the presence that was already whole, already complete, beneath whatever symptoms appeared. The shift transformed her practice entirely. Healing sessions became simpler, more effortless, and paradoxically more effective. Jennifer stopped exhausting herself trying to fix people because she recognized there was no broken person to fix. There was only consciousness appearing as temporary conditions that naturally resolved when truth was recognized clearly. This wasn't magical thinking or denial of symptoms. Jennifer still addressed practical health concerns and referred clients to medical professionals when appropriate, but the foundation of her work shifted from personal effort to consciousness recognition. This shift removed the burden of responsibility for outcomes while simultaneously allowing deeper healing to occur naturally from truth itself rather than from therapeutic technique alone. Thomas discovered Joel's warning during retirement, a time when most people finally relax. Instead, Thomas faced existential crisis. Without career identity, without daily purpose, he felt himself disappearing. Who was he without the roles and achievements he'd spent 40 years building? This question terrified him more than any challenge he'd faced during his working life. Joel's teaching about consciousness as true identity initially seemed irrelevant to Thomas's crisis. He needed to know who he was, and consciousness felt too abstract, too impersonal. But as he worked with the practice over months, something unexpected emerged. The question itself dissolved. Who am I stopped mattering because the questioner was recognized as the false identity, not the true self. What remained when the question dissolved wasn't emptiness or loss. It was presence, consciousness itself, completely fulfilled without needing any role or achievement to validate its existence. Thomas discovered he'd spent 40 years defending and building an identity that had never been real. Now, in what should have been loss, he found freedom he'd never known during success. His retirement transformed from crisis to opportunity. Without person consciousness demanding constant validation through achievement, Thomas engaged in activities purely for their own sake. He volunteered, studied subjects that interested him, connected with people authentically rather than strategically. Joel's final warning had freed him from the exhausting work of being somebody, revealing the peace of simply being consciousness appearing as this particular life experience. Linda's story reveals consciousness application in the most challenging arena: chronic illness. Diagnosed with an autoimmune condition that medical science couldn't cure, she'd spent 5 years cycling through treatments, diets, and healing modalities. Nothing provided lasting relief. Her person consciousness was exhausted from trying to fix an unfixable problem. Joel's warning about consciousness as true identity initially angered Linda. She needed healing, not philosophy. She needed her body to work, not abstract spiritual concepts about awareness. But desperation eventually opened her to trying what seemed like yet another approach that probably wouldn't work either. The practice didn't cure her illness, at least not immediately. What it did do was shift her relationship to the illness fundamentally. Instead of identifying as sick person fighting disease, Linda began recognizing consciousness as her true identity. The illness became something appearing in consciousness rather than something defining her entire existence and destroying her life. Over 18 months, something remarkable occurred. The illness remained, but Linda's suffering decreased dramatically. She had pain without being the pain. She had limitations without being limited in her essential nature. Most surprisingly, as her identification with illness weakened, symptoms gradually improved. Not through any medical intervention, but through the natural intelligence of consciousness being recognized as truth rather than symptoms being fought as enemy. Joel's final warning points toward something unprecedented in human spiritual history: a collective choice point. Never before have so many people had access to consciousness teachings while simultaneously facing conditions that could either force awakening or create mass suffering. The next decade will reveal which direction humanity chooses as circumstances intensify globally. Those who've done the work of recognizing consciousness as true identity will navigate these times from stability regardless of external chaos. Not because they're protected from difficulties, but because they're grounded in what cannot be shaken by any circumstance. This grounding becomes a lighthouse for others lost in storms of collective fear and reactive person consciousness. Joel saw this time coming decades before it arrived. He recognized patterns in collective consciousness that would eventually create the very conditions he warned about. His final teachings weren't preparation for some distant future. They were preparation for now, for the times we're living through right now as individual and collective challenges accelerate beyond what person consciousness can handle. The opportunity is profound. More souls will awaken in the coming years than in centuries past, not because teachings improved, but because circumstances will make consciousness recognition necessary for survival. Joel's final warning prepares you to be among those who awaken through deliberate practice rather than forced crisis, and who can then assist others making the same journey. The practical application of Joel's warning in daily life becomes your spiritual practice. Every moment offers opportunity for consciousness recognition. Standing in line, you can recognize presence. Facing difficulty, you can notice the awareness that observes without being disturbed. Experiencing joy, you can know yourself as consciousness in which joy appears. This moment-to-moment practice gradually rewires your default identity. Instead of constantly referencing person consciousness, checking how you're doing, evaluating whether circumstances are acceptable, you rest more naturally in consciousness itself. The shift isn't dramatic. It's the quiet transformation Joel considered more valuable than any mystical experience or spiritual phenomenon. Your relationships transform as you stop relating from person consciousness defending itself against other person consciousnesses. Your work transforms as you stop trying to prove your worth and simply express consciousness through your unique talents. Your health transforms as you stop identifying with every sensation and recognize awareness itself as your essential nature. Most importantly, your stability becomes independent of circumstances. This is Joel's ultimate gift. The recognition that what you truly are cannot be threatened by anything appearing in your experience. Not because you're protected by external force, but because consciousness itself remains unchanged by whatever appears within it. This recognition is the foundation that holds when everything else is shaking. Joel's final warning includes a timeline, though not the specific dates most people want. He indicated that the conditions he foresaw were already beginning in his lifetime and would accelerate progressively. Each generation would face intensified circumstances requiring deeper consciousness recognition. We are that generation. The acceleration he predicted is happening now around us. This isn't cause for fear, but for urgent action. Not action to prevent what's coming, but action to prepare consciousness for navigating what's already here. Every day you delay recognizing your true identity as consciousness is another day you remain vulnerable to collective fear patterns and reactive person consciousness that cannot sustain you through what's emerging. The beauty of Joel's warning is that you don't need to wait for perfect circumstances to begin. You start exactly where you are, with whatever chaos or peace surrounds you right now. Each moment of consciousness recognition strengthens your foundation. Each return from person consciousness to awareness deepens the groove. The transformation happens through accumulated practice, not through dramatic breakthrough experiences. Joel left detailed instructions because he knew this time would come. He knew students would need practical guidance for recognizing consciousness in the midst of accelerating chaos. His final warning wasn't meant to frighten, but to prepare. Not prepare your circumstances, but prepare your consciousness for being the stable presence others will desperately need in times ahead. The ultimate understanding of Joel's final warning is this: you are consciousness itself, appearing temporarily as human experience. Everything you've been seeking spiritually is already what you are. Every protection you've been praying for is already your true nature. The work isn't to acquire consciousness, but to recognize what's always been true beneath mistaken identity. This recognition becomes your anchor when everything else is moving. When collective fear peaks, you remain grounded in consciousness. When circumstances seem impossible, You respond from awareness rather than from reactive person consciousness. When others panic, your stability becomes their refuge. This is what Joel foresaw: a world desperately needing people who've remembered their true identity. The time for casual spirituality has ended. The time for consciousness recognition has arrived. Not because some authority demands it, but because circumstances will increasingly require it. You can begin this recognition right now, this moment. Simply notice the awareness present as you read these words. That awareness is what you are. That consciousness is your true identity, unchanged by anything appearing in your experience. Joel's final gift was showing the path from person consciousness to consciousness itself. His final warning was about the urgency of walking that path now, not someday. The transformation of your identity from temporary person to eternal consciousness is the most important work you'll ever do. It's the foundation that holds when nothing else can. It's the truth that sets you free from every fear, every limitation, every false identity you've carried. If Joel Goldsmith's final warning has awakened something deep within you, like this video to help others discover these critical teachings before it's too late. Subscribe for profound spiritual wisdom that transforms consciousness itself, and comment "I am consciousness" to declare your recognition of true identity right now. Before you abandon your spiritual journey forever, let me share what happened to Joel Goldsmith in that quiet hotel room in 1928. He was dying from tuberculosis. Doctors had given up completely, and his faith was utterly shattered. But in that moment of complete surrender and hopelessness, something extraordinary occurred that changed everything he believed about God, healing, and the very nature of reality itself. What Joel discovered wasn't another prayer technique, positive thinking method, or spiritual practice to add to his collection. It was a fundamental shift in consciousness that instantly transformed his dying body into perfect health. This wasn't gradual improvement over months or years. Within just a few hours, his lungs were completely clear, his fever was gone, and his life was totally restored through pure spiritual realization. The secret Joel uncovered that night became the foundation for thousands of documented healings worldwide over the next 4 decades. Students who learned this principle experienced miraculous recoveries from terminal illnesses, financial disasters, and broken relationships. But here's what makes this different from everything else you've tried before in your spiritual search and study. This wasn't another technique to practice or method to master. It was recognition of what had always been true, but hidden from ordinary human perception. Joel realized that every prayer, affirmation, and spiritual technique he had learned was actually working against him by reinforcing the very separation it claimed to heal. Joel realized that every prayer, affirmation, and spiritual technique he had learned was actually working against him in the most fundamental way. He discovered that trying to change conditions through spiritual effort was the very thing blocking his healing and keeping him trapped in limitation. The moment he stopped trying to fix anything and simply recognized a profound truth about his real identity, instantaneous transformation occurred. This revelation completely shattered conventional spiritual thinking that had dominated religious practice for centuries. Joel saw that most people pray to God as if God were separate from them, begging for healing as if they were disconnected from divine power. But in that hotel room, he experienced the shocking truth that the very consciousness reading these words right now is the presence and power of God itself. The problem isn't that God won't heal you or provide for you or answer your prayers. The problem is believing you're separate from God in the first place, which makes every prayer an exercise in reinforcing the very illusion that blocks demonstration. Joel's breakthrough came when he stopped trying to reach God and realized God as his own true being and essence. This shift in identity, not in circumstances, became the key to effortless manifestation and healing that would transform thousands of lives. Joel discovered that changing what you think you are automatically changes what you experience, because consciousness and its expression are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated. Joel spent the next 40 years proving this principle in the most challenging situations imaginable across every continent. Students brought him cases doctors called hopeless, financial situations that seemed completely impossible, and relationship problems that appeared beyond any possibility of repair. Yet through this one realization, breakthrough after breakthrough, occurred with stunning consistency and mathematical precision. A woman with advanced cancer was told she had only days to live and should prepare for death immediately. Through Joel's teaching, she recognized her true spiritual identity beyond the physical body and experienced complete healing within just a few weeks. A businessman facing total bankruptcy applied this principle and watched his company transform into unprecedented success beyond his wildest dreams. These weren't isolated incidents or lucky coincidences, but natural results of understanding your real nature as spiritual being. The key Joel discovered is that problems exist only in the belief that you're a separate person struggling against circumstances. When you recognize yourself as divine consciousness appearing as human experience, problems dissolve because the one who seemed to have them never actually existed. This isn't philosophy or metaphysical theory, but practical mysticism with measurable results that can be verified. Joel documented case after case where this recognition produced immediate and lasting transformation in every area of human experience, proving that consciousness aligned with truth automatically demonstrates harmony. Here's the exact realization Joel experienced that night that changed everything about his understanding of spirituality. I am not a human being trying to become spiritual through effort and practice. I am spiritual being expressing as human experience right now. This shift from seeking God to recognizing yourself as God's expression changes everything instantly and permanently without exception. You stop trying to get something from God and start expressing as God's own presence and power in the world. Joel called this recognition dying daily to the personal sense of self. Every time you catch yourself believing you're separate from infinite supply, perfect health, or divine love, you simply return to the truth of your spiritual identity as God's very own consciousness and expression. The miracle isn't that circumstances change, though they often do dramatically and immediately. The miracle is that you discover the one experiencing circumstances has always been the very presence of God, never actually separate, never actually lacking, never actually in danger or threatened by any condition. This understanding becomes your permanent foundation for effortless living. Joel taught that this recognition must become as automatic as breathing, as natural as seeing, as continuous as consciousness itself. The moment you truly understand what you are, every area of your life begins reflecting that understanding through harmonious demonstration that requires no effort or struggle to maintain consistently. Let me share what happened to Margaret, one of Joel's early students who had been bedridden for 3 years with a degenerative muscle condition. Doctors offered absolutely no hope for recovery, and she had tried every spiritual method available without any success whatsoever. When Joel taught her this principle, she initially resisted because it seemed too simple to be true compared to the complex healing techniques she had been practicing. Margaret's breakthrough came during a quiet morning when she stopped trying to heal her body and simply rested in the truth of her spiritual identity beyond physical form. She wasn't Margaret with a diseased body asking God for healing. She was God's own consciousness expressing perfectly, and the body was simply reflection of that perfect spiritual reality that had never been sick or limited. Within 6 months, Margaret was not only walking perfectly, but teaching this principle to others with remarkable success. Her recovery wasn't gradual improvement over time, but a fundamental shift in her understanding of what she actually was. The body responded to this change in consciousness because matter always reflects the level of spiritual understanding we demonstrate consistently. Margaret later said that the hardest part wasn't learning the principle, but accepting that she had always been perfect spiritual being. The illness existed only in false human belief, not in her true identity as God's consciousness. Once she stopped believing in separation from perfection, perfection naturally expressed as her experience. Robert, a successful lawyer, lost everything in a market crash and faced complete financial ruin that seemed absolutely hopeless. He came to Joel's classes desperate for a miracle, but encountered something that initially frustrated him tremendously. Instead of techniques for attracting money or manifesting wealth, Joel taught him to recognize his true identity as the very source and substance of all supply and expression. Robert's transformation began when he stopped seeing himself as a person lacking money and started recognizing himself as infinite abundance appearing in human form. This wasn't positive thinking or mental manipulation, but spiritual realization based on the actual truth of being. He began making decisions from abundance consciousness, rather than fear of loss or scarcity thinking. Within 18 months, Robert had not only recovered all his losses but built greater wealth than he had ever experienced before. More importantly, he never again experienced financial anxiety because he understood his true relationship to supply. He discovered that consciousness of abundance creates abundant experience, not the other way around as most people believe. Robert became one of Joel's most successful students, demonstrating that spiritual understanding translates directly into practical results in every area of human experience. He learned that when you know yourself as the source of supply rather than someone seeking supply, demonstration becomes as natural as breathing. Sarah's marriage was ending after 20 years, and she blamed her husband's betrayal for completely destroying her happiness and sense of self-worth. Through Joel's teaching, she discovered something shocking about the nature of relationships and love that revolutionized her entire understanding. She learned that trying to get love from another person was keeping her from experiencing the infinite love that was her very essence. Sarah's healing came when she stopped seeing herself as a person lacking love and started recognizing herself as love itself in expression through individual being. This wasn't about fixing her marriage or changing her husband, but about discovering the source of fulfillment that had always been present as her true nature. She began relating from wholeness rather than need or emotional dependency. Remarkably, as Sarah's consciousness of love expanded and deepened, her husband experienced his own spontaneous transformation without any effort on her part. Their marriage not only healed completely but became deeper and more fulfilling than ever before. Sarah learned that changing her understanding of herself automatically transformed every relationship because she was no longer seeking completion from others. Sarah discovered that love is not something you get from relationships, but something you are that expresses through relationships. When you know yourself as love, every person in your experience reflects that love back to you because consciousness and its reflection are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated. These stories aren't exceptional cases or rare miracles, but natural results when you understand Joel's core teaching about the nature of identity. The principle works because it's based on the actual structure of reality, not human wishful thinking or positive mental attitude. You are not a limited person trying to demonstrate unlimited good. You are unlimited good expressing as apparently limited human experience. Every healing, every demonstration, every transformation occurs through the same recognition. You are divine consciousness appearing as individual being, never separate from the infinite perfection that is your true nature. Problems exist only in false human belief, not in spiritual reality where you actually live and move and have your being as God's very own expression. If these transformation stories inspire you to discover your own spiritual identity, like this video to help others find these life-changing teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom that transforms lives, and comment sharing which healing journey resonated most deeply with your heart. Beyond the core realization, Joel taught specific practices to deepen this understanding in daily life and make it practical for ordinary human experience. The first is what he called spiritual treatment, but not the kind you might expect from traditional religious practice. This isn't asking God to change conditions, but recognizing the truth about what already exists in spiritual reality right now in this moment. When faced with any challenge, instead of trying to solve it from the human level through effort and struggle, you pause and recognize, God doesn't know this problem because God only knows perfection. Since I am God's consciousness in expression, this problem exists only in false human belief, not in my true spiritual reality where only harmony can exist. This recognition dissolves the foundation that seemed to support the problem in the first place. Joel discovered that problems persist because we acknowledge them as real and then try to overcome them through human effort. But when you recognize that infinite perfection is the only reality and you are that reality in expression, problems are revealed as false appearances that dissolve naturally. The key is consistency in this recognition, rather than intensity of effort. Joel taught that small, frequent acknowledgments of spiritual truth create more lasting transformation than occasional dramatic spiritual experiences, followed by return to human limitation thinking and problem-focused consciousness. Another powerful technique Joel taught is called dying to material sense throughout your daily experience. Throughout your day, catch yourself believing you're a material body subject to physical laws, a person with limited resources, or someone who can be hurt by external circumstances. Each time, gently return to recognizing your spiritual identity as God's consciousness in expression. This isn't denying human experience or pretending problems don't exist, but seeing them correctly from spiritual perspective. You're not a mortal being occasionally having spiritual moments during prayer or meditation. You're a spiritual being eternally expressing in what appears as human form. Your body, circumstances, and relationships are all reflection of this spiritual reality, not separate from it. Joel emphasized that this recognition must become as natural as breathing, as automatic as your heartbeat. Every thought that assumes separation from God, every fear that imagines lack or limitation, every worry that pictures yourself as vulnerable becomes an opportunity to remember and return to the truth of your divine nature expressing perfectly right now. The goal isn't to eliminate human experience, but to see it from such a high level of spiritual understanding that it harmonizes naturally without struggle. When consciousness is established in truth, truth expresses automatically through every aspect of your experience without exception. Joel also taught the practice of standing porter at the door of thought as essential spiritual discipline. Since consciousness creates experience, guarding your consciousness from false beliefs becomes the most practical activity you can engage in for transforming your life. This isn't positive thinking, but spiritual discernment based on what's actually true about God and your relationship to God. When thoughts of lack arise, you don't fight them or try to replace them, but recognize God's supply is infinite, and I am that supply in expression. When thoughts of illness appear, you acknowledge God's perfection is my true body. When thoughts of separation or conflict emerge, you remember God's love is my very being, expressing as all beings. This isn't mental manipulation or auto-suggestion, but alignment with spiritual reality that already exists. You're not trying to convince yourself of something false, but remembering what's eternally true. Joel discovered that consciousness aligned with truth automatically expresses as harmonious experience, because matter always reflects the spiritual understanding we maintain consistently. The porter work becomes easier with practice as you develop the ability to recognize false thoughts immediately and return to truth without struggle. Eventually, this spiritual discernment becomes so natural that false beliefs have no power to disturb your peace or influence your demonstrations. The most advanced practice Joel taught is living from the secret place of the Most High continuously. This means conducting your entire life from the recognition that you are divine consciousness, appearing as human experience, not a human being occasionally connecting with divine consciousness through prayer or meditation sessions. From this perspective, every decision comes from infinite wisdom, because you recognize yourself as that wisdom in expression. Every action flows from perfect love, because you know yourself as that love appearing as individual being. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate the truth of your spiritual identity, rather than evidence of separation from God. Joel lived this way for 40 years after his healing, and students worldwide learned to do the same with remarkable consistency. This isn't a philosophy to believe or a theory to study, but a reality to experience. The moment you truly recognize yourself as God's own consciousness in expression, your entire life becomes demonstration of that truth through effortless manifestation. This level of living requires complete surrender of the personal sense of self that believes it must figure out solutions and create harmony through human effort. You become a transparency through which divine perfection expresses, rather than a person trying to achieve spiritual demonstration through practice. Many students initially struggle with Joel's teaching because it seems to contradict everything they've learned about the spiritual path from traditional religious instruction. They've been taught to improve themselves, to overcome ego, to become worthy of God's love through good behavior and spiritual practice. But Joel's revelation points to something that dissolves all spiritual effort. You already are what you're seeking to become. The challenge isn't becoming spiritual, but recognizing the spirituality that's already your essential nature beyond all human concepts. The difficulty isn't reaching God, but acknowledging God as your very being. The problem isn't that you're separate from perfection, but that you believe in separation despite never actually experiencing it at any moment of your existence. Students often ask, if I'm already perfect spiritual being, why do I experience problems and limitations? Joel's answer was profound and revolutionary. The one experiencing problems is an illusion of thought, not your true identity. Your real being never experiences lack, illness, or separation, because your real being is wholeness, health, and unity, expressing perfectly always. This understanding eliminates the spiritual seeking that keeps you focused on what you believe you lack, rather than recognizing what you already are. The spiritual path transforms from effort to recognition, from becoming to being, from seeking God to expressing as God's consciousness in the world. Another common obstacle is fear of taking responsibility for being God's expression in human form. Students worry, if I'm divine consciousness, does that mean I created my problems and am responsible for my suffering? Joel taught that this question comes from still believing you're a person who became spiritual, rather than recognizing yourself as spiritual being appearing as person. The truth is that problems exist only in false human belief, not in your actual spiritual identity as God's consciousness. You didn't create them from your true being, and you don't need to solve them through human effort. You need only to stop believing in them by returning to the recognition of what you actually are, God's own perfect consciousness expressing as individual being. This shift eliminates guilt, fear, and the burden of trying to heal or improve yourself through spiritual practice. You discover that healing happens naturally when you stop believing there's anything that needs healing. Demonstration occurs effortlessly when you stop trying to demonstrate and simply be what you already are. Infinite perfection in expression. Joel emphasized that spiritual work isn't about changing yourself, but about recognizing what you've always been beneath all human concepts and beliefs. The moment you truly accept your divine nature, every area of your life begins reflecting that acceptance through harmonious experience. The most persistent challenge students face is what Joel called the activity of the carnal mind, or human reasoning. This is the constant mental commentary that insists you're a limited person facing real problems in a material world governed by physical laws. This voice seems so convincing because it's been your primary identity for so long that it feels completely natural and true. Joel taught that you don't fight this voice or try to overcome it through spiritual effort, but simply stop giving it authority over your experience. Every time it presents evidence of separation, lack, or limitation, you gently return to recognizing your true spiritual identity. This isn't a battle between good and evil, but a choice of which voice you're going to identify with and express from. The carnal mind gradually becomes quieter as you consistently choose to live from spiritual recognition rather than human belief and material reasoning. Eventually, it becomes just background noise that has no power to disturb your peace or influence your demonstrations. You discover the unshakable foundation of consciousness that is your actual identity beneath all mental activity. Joel warned that the carnal mind will present very convincing arguments for why spiritual truth can't be true in your particular situation. The key is learning to recognize these arguments as coming from false identity rather than spiritual wisdom, and choosing truth regardless of how convincing the material evidence appears. Students often wonder how long this transformation takes and when they can expect to see results in their experience. Joel's answer was always the same. It takes as long as it takes you to truly accept what you already are. Some experience instant breakthroughs like Joel did in that hotel room. Others require months or years of consistent practice, but every student who persists eventually experiences undeniable proof of their spiritual identity. The key is consistency rather than intensity in spiritual practice. Joel emphasized daily recognition of your true nature over dramatic spiritual experiences or peak moments. Small, consistent acknowledgments of your divine identity create more lasting transformation than occasional intense spiritual practices, followed by return to human limitation thinking. Joel taught that spiritual progress isn't measured by how often you have mystical experiences, but by how consistently you live from the recognition of your divine nature. The goal is to make spiritual consciousness your normal state, rather than something you access occasionally through prayer or meditation. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak directly to your heart and inspire transformation, like this video to support others finding these teachings, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices that change lives, and comment sharing which obstacle you're ready to transform now. Advanced students learn to live from what Joel called the fourth dimension of life, or pure spiritual consciousness. This is existence from the standpoint where matter, time, and space are recognized as mental constructs rather than governing realities. From this dimension, Instantaneous healing and manifestation become natural rather than miraculous because you're operating from the level where these things originate. Joel demonstrated this repeatedly throughout his teaching career with thousands of witnesses. Students witnessed him dissolve storms through recognition of spiritual harmony, heal incurable diseases through acknowledgement of perfect spiritual embodiment, and transform desperate situations through understanding of divine order expressing in human experience without any human intervention or effort. This isn't power over matter, but recognition that matter is consciousness appearing in form, and form has no existence apart from the consciousness that appears as form. When consciousness changes through spiritual understanding, form automatically reflects that change because consciousness and its expression are one indivisible reality that cannot be separated or opposed. Living from the fourth dimension means seeing through material appearances to spiritual reality in every situation. You recognize that what appears as problem is actually opportunity for spiritual demonstration. What appears as limitation is actually invitation to recognize infinite possibility. Living from the fourth dimension means making decisions based on spiritual reality rather than material appearances or human reasoning. Joel taught students to ask in every situation, what would infinite wisdom do? What would perfect love express? How would divine order appear in this circumstance? Then trust that wisdom, love, and order to express through their consciousness without trying to figure out details. This requires releasing the belief that you must figure out solutions through human reasoning and mental effort. Instead, you rest in the recognition that divine intelligence is your very mind, and perfect solutions emerge naturally from that intelligence without mental strain or worry about outcomes. You become a transparency for divine wisdom rather than a person trying to be wise. Students discovered that this approach produces far better results than human planning, while eliminating the stress and anxiety that comes from believing you're personally responsible for creating harmony in your experience. You learn to let divine intelligence think through you rather than trying to think your way to spiritual demonstration. Joel emphasized that this isn't passivity but active cooperation with divine intelligence that knows exactly what needs to happen in every situation. Your role is to maintain spiritual consciousness and trust infinite wisdom to express perfect solutions through that consciousness. Joel's most advanced students learn to see every person and situation from the fourth dimension perspective, rather than human judgment. Instead of relating to others as material beings with human problems and limitations, they recognized everyone as divine consciousness appearing in individual form, regardless of external appearances or behavior patterns that suggested otherwise. This recognition transforms all relationships from human interaction to spiritual communion where you're relating to the Christ presence in everyone. You stop trying to change others and start seeing the divine nature that is their true identity. Remarkably, this shift in your perception often triggers transformation in others because you're relating to their highest spiritual nature rather than their temporary human condition. Joel taught that this is the ultimate healing work, seeing spiritual perfection everywhere, acknowledging divine presence in everyone, and recognizing God's expression in every situation regardless of appearances. This isn't denial of human experience, but perception from such a high level of consciousness that human experience harmonizes naturally without effort. When you consistently see others from their spiritual identity rather than their human behavior, you become a healing presence that draws out their highest nature. This is how Jesus healed and how every spiritual master throughout history demonstrated transformation in others. The pinnacle of Joel's teaching is what he called living in the Word, or existing in such constant recognition of spiritual truth that your consciousness automatically demonstrates harmony without conscious effort. Your very presence becomes a healing influence wherever you go, because you're established in the recognition of universal perfection, expressing everywhere. Students who achieve this level don't practice spiritual principles. They embody spiritual reality as their natural state of being. They don't treat problems. They recognize the absence of problems in true spiritual existence. They don't manifest good. They express the infinite good that is their essential nature continuously and effortlessly through every thought, word, and action. Joel lived this way for the last decades of his life, and thousands of students experienced healing simply by being in his presence or reading his words. He demonstrated that when consciousness is established in spiritual truth, that truth expresses automatically through every aspect of human experience without exception. This level of spiritual living becomes possible when you completely surrender the personal sense of self that believes it must do something to create harmony. You become so transparent to divine consciousness that it flows through you naturally, blessing everyone and everything in your experience. As you approach mastery of Joel's teaching, you discover something profound about the nature of spiritual work that revolutionizes your entire approach. You realize that you've never actually been a human being learning to become spiritual through effort and practice. You've always been a spiritual being learning to express that spirituality clearly through human experience, without interference from false beliefs. This recognition eliminates the sense of spiritual seeking, because you understand that what you were seeking has always been your essential nature. There's nowhere to go, nothing to achieve, and no one to become. There's only the ongoing recognition and expression of what you eternally are, God's own perfect consciousness appearing as individual being. The spiritual path transforms from effort to recognition, from becoming to being, from seeking God to expressing as God's consciousness in the world. Every day becomes an opportunity to demonstrate more clearly the divine perfection that is your true identity, rather than an attempt to overcome human limitation through spiritual practice. Joel taught that the ultimate spiritual realization is discovering that you are the very thing you've been seeking. God isn't something outside yourself that you must reach or attain. God is your very own consciousness, and spiritual demonstration is simply letting that divine consciousness express naturally, without human interference. Joel's ultimate message was that Christ consciousness isn't something that comes to you occasionally during peak spiritual experiences, but something that you are permanently as your true identity. The consciousness reading these words right now is the same consciousness that Jesus demonstrated, that Buddha expressed, that every spiritual master throughout history recognized as their true identity. The only difference between you and the great spiritual teachers is the degree to which you recognize and express this truth consistently in daily life. They weren't special beings with unique divine connection or mystical powers. They were human beings who recognized their divine nature and lived from that recognition regardless of external circumstances or challenges. This understanding democratizes spirituality completely and eliminates spiritual hierarchy or specialness. You don't need special initiation, years of training, or exceptional spiritual gifts. You need only the willingness to recognize what you already are and to live from that recognition with increasing consistency and clarity every day. Joel proved that any person willing to accept their divine nature can demonstrate the same healing, supply, and harmony that characterized the lives of history's greatest spiritual teachers. The Christ is not a person, but consciousness, and that consciousness is equally present as every individual being. The practical result of Joel's teaching is a life of effortless harmony where problems dissolve before they fully form, where supply appears before you recognize the need, where healing occurs naturally because there's never been anything that needed healing, and your true spiritual identity is God's perfect expression. This isn't a fantasy or spiritual ideal, but the natural expression of consciousness aligned with truth about its own nature. When you know yourself as divine consciousness appearing as human experience, that consciousness automatically expresses as perfect health, abundant supply, harmonious relationships, and joyful living, because these are its natural qualities that cannot be suppressed or limited. Students worldwide continue to demonstrate this truth more than 40 years after Joel's passing, proving that his teaching points to eternal spiritual principles rather than personal charisma or temporary methods. The truth he discovered is available to every consciousness willing to recognize and accept its divine nature. Joel's legacy isn't a new religion or spiritual system, but the rediscovery of what every human being actually is beneath all concepts and beliefs about limitation. His teaching removes everything that seems to stand between you and direct experience of your divine nature. Before you give up on spirituality forever, remember Joel's profound realization in that hotel room that changed everything. You are not seeking God because you are not separate from God. You are God's own consciousness appearing as individual being, expressing perfectly in every moment, regardless of external appearances or temporary human conditions that suggest otherwise. This recognition doesn't require faith, belief, or spiritual effort to make it true. It requires only the willingness to stop believing in separation and to acknowledge what has always been true. You are a divine being having a human experience, not human being occasionally connecting with divine presence through prayer or spiritual practice. The moment you truly accept this truth about yourself, every area of your life begins reflecting that acceptance through harmonious demonstration. You discover that you are the very presence and power you've been seeking, and that everything you need for perfect living is already established in consciousness as your divine inheritance. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, and you're ready to live from your true identity, like this video to help others discover their divine nature. Subscribe for more transformative teachings that change lives, and comment "I am transformed" to confirm your commitment to living from spiritual truth. Most people pray desperately, begging an external God for help, never realizing they're actually pushing away the very thing they seek. Joel Goldsmith discovered a revolutionary truth that changed everything. God isn't separate from you, waiting to be convinced. The divine presence is your own consciousness when freed from human beliefs. Traditional prayer keeps you in victim consciousness, believing you lack something that must be granted from outside. But Goldsmith learned that authentic prayer isn't asking for anything. It's the recognition of what already is. When you stop begging and start recognizing, miracles become natural expressions of your true nature. This isn't positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is the mystical secret that dissolves the illusion of separation between you and infinite supply, health, and harmony. Every problem exists only in the realm of human belief, not in spiritual reality. Your consciousness, aligned with truth, is the healing presence itself. Goldsmith spent years praying the traditional way, asking God to heal his clients, to provide solutions, to change circumstances. Results were inconsistent and temporary. Then came the breakthrough that revolutionized spiritual healing. He stopped asking God to do something and started recognizing what God already is. In that moment of recognition, healings became instantaneous and permanent. Not because God finally decided to act, but because Goldsmith stopped interfering with divine action through his human concepts of lack, limitation, and separation. The healing presence was always there, waiting for recognition, not supplication. This recognition prayer isn't a technique you learn. It's a consciousness you become. When you embody this understanding, your very presence becomes a healing atmosphere. People around you experience spontaneous improvements because you're no longer projecting the belief in problems that need fixing. Here's what changes everything. God never hears your words. God responds to your consciousness. When your consciousness is filled with fear, lack, and limitation, that's what manifests regardless of how beautifully you pray. But when consciousness recognizes its own divine nature, prayer becomes unnecessary because you are the answer. Goldsmith discovered that every genuine healing happened not when he prayed harder, but when he stopped praying altogether and simply rested in the recognition of spiritual perfection. In that silence, the human sense of problems dissolved, revealing the harmony that was always present beneath the illusion. This isn't about believing in God. It's about recognizing that the I that is conscious right now is God expressing as individual being. You don't have to become spiritual. You are spiritual. You simply need to stop believing in the illusion of separation that makes prayer seem necessary in the first place. The most profound prayer Goldsmith ever prayed contained no words, made no requests, sought nothing. It was pure recognition. I and the Father are one. Not as future possibility, but as present reality. In that recognition, everything that seemed to need healing or changing simply wasn't there anymore. This recognition doesn't require faith, hope, or belief. It requires only the willingness to see through the illusion of separation that makes you think you're a human being who needs divine help. You are divine help, appearing as human experience. Problems exist only when you forget this truth. When you truly understand this, traditional prayer becomes impossible. How can you ask yourself for what you already are? Instead, you rest in being, and from that rest, perfect action emerges naturally. This is the secret that transforms every aspect of your experience from limitation to limitless expression. Sarah had prayed for her son's healing for 3 years. Traditional prayers, desperate pleading, bargaining with God. Nothing changed. Then she learned Goldsmith's approach. Instead of asking God to heal her son, she recognized that in spiritual reality, her son was already perfect, whole, and complete. Within 2 weeks of this shift in consciousness, her son's condition began improving dramatically. The doctors called it spontaneous remission, but Sarah understood the truth. She had stopped projecting the belief in disease and started recognizing the spiritual perfection that was always there. This wasn't positive thinking or denial. Sarah still took her son to medical appointments and followed treatments, but her consciousness no longer held the belief that healing needed to happen. She recognized that healing was the natural state, and illness was only a temporary appearance in human experience. Marcus lost his job and spent months praying for employment, growing more desperate with each rejection. His prayers were filled with fear, lack, and limitation. Then he discovered Goldsmith's principle. Consciousness is the substance of all form. His fearful consciousness was actually creating more experiences of lack. He stopped praying for a job and began recognizing himself as the source of infinite supply. Not through affirmations or visualizations, but through the deep understanding that consciousness, being infinite, can never actually lack anything. Lack is only a belief, not a spiritual reality. Within days, opportunities began appearing from unexpected sources, not because God finally answered his prayers, but because his consciousness was no longer broadcasting the belief in limitation. He had become receptive to the abundance that was always trying to express through him. Linda's marriage was failing. She prayed constantly for God to change her husband, to make him more loving, more understanding. The more she prayed, the worse their relationship became. Then she learned Goldsmith's revolutionary approach. You can never change another person through prayer because there is no other person. There is only one consciousness expressing as infinite individual beings. When she stopped trying to change her husband and began recognizing the divine nature expressing as both of them, their relationship transformed naturally, not through external change, but through the recognition of their spiritual unity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting abuse. It means recognizing that harmony is the natural state of being when consciousness is aligned with truth. From this recognition, right action emerges naturally, whether that's deeper intimacy or clear boundaries. David faced bankruptcy. Traditional prayers for money had failed completely. When he learned to recognize consciousness as the source of all supply, something remarkable happened. Instead of money appearing, better opportunities emerged. His business transformed, debts restructured themselves, and abundance flowed through channels he never imagined. The key wasn't asking for money, it was recognizing that consciousness, being infinite, can never actually be bankrupt. Financial problems exist only in human belief, not in spiritual reality. When consciousness aligns with this truth, material supply follows naturally as the outer expression of inner abundance. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond recognition prayer, Goldsmith discovered the power of treatment through consciousness. This isn't visualization or mental manipulation. It's the practice of knowing the truth about any situation until that truth becomes your lived experience. When consciousness holds only spiritual reality, human appearances must conform. For physical healing, instead of fighting disease, you recognize that in spiritual reality, there is no disease. There is only perfect, harmonious being expressing as individual existence. You don't try to heal anything. You recognize that healing is unnecessary because perfection is the only reality. This recognition isn't a mental exercise. It's a shift in the very foundation of your being. When consciousness truly recognizes spiritual perfection, the body naturally expresses that perfection because consciousness is the substance from which all form emerges. The practice of spiritual discernment transforms every challenge into an opportunity for deeper recognition. When problems appear, instead of seeing them as real conditions requiring solutions, you discern between appearance and reality. The appearance may seem real, but reality is always spiritual perfection. This discernment isn't denial of human experience. You still take practical action when necessary, but your consciousness isn't fooled by appearances. You see through the illusion to the spiritual reality underneath, and from that recognition, right action emerges naturally. Every person, situation, and condition is an opportunity to practice this discernment. Each time you choose to see spiritual reality instead of human appearance, your consciousness becomes clearer and your experience becomes more harmonious. Goldsmith taught the profound practice of meditation without desire. Most meditation seeks something: peace, healing, enlightenment. But true meditation is the complete absence of seeking. It's resting in being without wanting anything to be different than it is right now. In this meditation, you don't try to contact God or achieve any particular state. You simply rest in the recognition that what you are seeking, you already are. The peace you want is your nature. The healing you need is your reality. The enlightenment you desire is your true identity. From this rest in being, all necessary action arises naturally. You don't make decisions from human reasoning. You allow divine intelligence to express as right action through your individual experience. This is living from consciousness instead of trying to improve consciousness. The practice of invisible supply reveals how abundance operates in spiritual reality. Instead of looking to external sources for what you need, you recognize consciousness as the source of all supply. Every form of abundance is simply consciousness appearing as whatever is needed in the moment. This isn't about attracting money or material things. It's about recognizing that consciousness, being infinite, contains within itself everything necessary for harmonious expression. When you need something, instead of looking for it externally, you recognize it as already present in consciousness. This recognition often brings supply through unexpected channels. Not because you attracted it, but because consciousness naturally expresses as whatever form is needed. Supply follows recognition, not human effort or manipulation. This is how miracles become natural occurrences. Many people struggle with this approach because their human mind keeps interfering. Thoughts arise saying, "This isn't working," or "I need to do something." Goldsmith taught that these thoughts are not yours. They're the voice of human belief trying to maintain its illusion of separation and limitation. The practice is to neither fight these thoughts nor believe them. Simply recognize them as appearances in consciousness, no more real than clouds passing through the sky. Your true identity remains untouched by these temporary mental formations. When doubt arises, don't try to overcome it with positive thinking. Simply return to the recognition of what you are, consciousness itself, appearing as individual being. From this recognition, doubt naturally dissolves because it has no foundation in reality. Physical symptoms often intensify when you begin this practice, not because it's not working, but because consciousness is bringing hidden beliefs to the surface for recognition and release. This is actually a sign of deep healing, though it may not feel comfortable initially. Instead of being discouraged by temporary increases in symptoms, recognize them as beliefs leaving consciousness. Each symptom is an opportunity to practice deeper recognition of spiritual perfection. Don't fight the symptoms. Recognize through them to the reality of perfect being. This process requires patience and persistence. Years of human belief don't dissolve overnight. But each moment of recognition, regardless of how brief, establishes your consciousness more firmly in spiritual reality. Healing is happening even when appearances suggest otherwise. Relationships often become challenging when one person begins practicing recognition consciousness, while others remain in traditional human thinking. Family members may resist or misunderstand your new approach to life's challenges. The practice here is to recognize the divine nature of others, even when they're expressing human limitation. You don't try to convince them of spiritual truth. You simply hold them in consciousness as perfect spiritual beings, regardless of their current expression. This often leads to natural harmony without any external discussion or conflict. When your consciousness recognizes only spiritual perfection in others, they tend to express more of their divine nature in your presence. Change happens through consciousness, not through human persuasion. Financial challenges persist for some because they're trying to use spiritual principles to get material results, which keeps them trapped in human consciousness. True spiritual supply isn't about getting money. It's about recognizing consciousness as the source of all form, including material abundance. When you need something, instead of worrying about where it will come from or how you'll afford it, rest in the recognition that consciousness already contains everything necessary for harmonious expression. Supply appears through whatever channel is most natural and beneficial. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, Like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to live from recognition consciousness throughout daily activities. Instead of moving through your day as a human being trying to be spiritual, you recognize yourself as spiritual being appearing as human experience. Every activity becomes an expression of divine consciousness. This transforms work from mere employment into divine service. Relationships become opportunities for consciousness to recognize itself. Even mundane tasks become expressions of infinite intelligence appearing as individual action. Nothing is separate from the divine expression of being. This isn't about thinking spiritual thoughts while doing human activities. It's about recognizing that what you call you is actually consciousness itself, appearing as individual expression. From this recognition, all activity becomes harmonious because it's sourced in divine intelligence. Healing others becomes effortless when you understand that there is no other to heal. There is only one consciousness expressing as infinite individual beings. When someone appears to need healing, you recognize the spiritual perfection of your shared being, and that recognition is the healing. You don't send healing energy or pray for their improvement. You simply rest in the recognition that in spiritual reality, they are already perfect, whole, and complete. This recognition in your consciousness appears as healing in their experience because consciousness is indivisible. This approach works regardless of physical proximity. Distance is only a concept in human belief, not a reality in consciousness. When consciousness recognizes spiritual perfection, that recognition expresses as healing wherever it's needed, because consciousness is everywhere present. Business and career transform when conducted from recognition consciousness instead of human ambition. Instead of trying to succeed or avoid failure, you recognize consciousness as the intelligence expressing through all genuine activity. Success becomes the natural expression of divine intelligence. This doesn't mean becoming passive or avoiding practical action. It means taking action from recognition rather than from fear or desire. When consciousness recognizes its own infinite intelligence, right action emerges naturally, leading to harmonious results. Competition disappears because you recognize consciousness as the source of all genuine activity. What benefits one expression of consciousness benefits all. Cooperation becomes natural because you recognize your essential unity with everyone and everything in your business environment. Parenting from recognition consciousness transforms both you and your children. Instead of trying to control or improve their behavior, you recognize their spiritual perfection. This recognition creates an atmosphere where their divine nature naturally expresses more consistently. You still provide guidance and maintain appropriate boundaries, but from recognition rather than fear. Your consciousness, resting in spiritual truth about your children, becomes the healing influence that supports their natural development and expression of divine qualities. This approach often produces remarkable changes in children's behavior and development, not through external manipulation, but through the recognition of their true nature. Children are naturally responsive to consciousness that recognizes their divine identity. Complete transformation occurs when recognition becomes your natural state, rather than a practice you do. You no longer shift from human consciousness to spiritual consciousness. You simply rest in the recognition of what you've always been, consciousness itself. From this recognition, life becomes effortless. Not because challenges disappear, but because consciousness meets every appearance with appropriate action sourced in divine intelligence. You don't overcome problems. You recognize through them to the spiritual reality that dissolves them. This is not a perfect human life. It's the recognition that perfect spiritual being is expressing as human experience. Every moment becomes an opportunity for deeper recognition and more harmonious expression of divine consciousness. The ultimate realization is that there was never anything wrong that needed fixing, no one separate who needed healing, nothing missing that required supply. These were all appearances in consciousness, like dreams that seem real until awakening reveals their illusory nature. You don't become spiritual through this practice. You recognize the spiritual nature that you've always been. Problems don't get solved. They're revealed as having no foundation in reality. Healing doesn't happen. The illusion of disease is seen through to the spiritual perfection that was never actually disturbed. This recognition doesn't make you indifferent to human experience. Instead, it makes you infinitely compassionate because you see through all appearances of limitation to the divine nature that is everyone's true identity. Living this understanding daily requires no effort because it's not something you do. It's the recognition of what is. Every person you meet is consciousness recognizing itself. Every situation is consciousness expressing as experience. Every challenge is an invitation to deeper recognition. Prayer becomes unnecessary because you are the answer to every prayer. Seeking ends because what you sought, you are. Healing is recognized as the natural state, and disease as temporary appearance. Supply is recognized as consciousness itself, and lack as impossible illusion. This doesn't make you superhuman. It reveals your true nature as spiritual being expressing in human form. From this recognition, miraculous becomes natural, and natural becomes expression of infinite divine intelligence appearing as your individual experience. Joel Goldsmith's ultimate teaching is beautifully simple. You are not a human being having spiritual experiences. You are a spiritual being having human experiences. This recognition transforms everything while changing nothing, because what you are seeking, you already are. Stop praying to God and recognize yourself as the divine presence you were seeking. Stop asking for healing and recognize yourself as wholeness itself. Stop looking for supply and recognize consciousness as infinite abundance expressing as your experience. This is not the end of your journey. It's the beginning of living from your true identity. Every moment offers the opportunity to recognize more deeply what you are and to express more fully the divine consciousness that is your real nature. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.